Excellent. So what I want to actually point out to you is, strangely enough, this little alleyway here. Because if you were here 300 or 400 years ago, you'd be on a boat down here, looking up a slipway towards the walls of Old Kinsale, the old town up here. In other words, barrels of trade would have rolled up and down towards the boats, or imports and exports. And this brings us to the big picture. The big picture around us here is a perfect sheltered harbour defended by 2 English-built star-shaped forts windward of England. What I mean by that is our prevailing wind is southwesterly, blows towards England. 2 days sail to Bristol from here, even 300 or 400 years ago. So we've very strong links with English history. The first thing I had to learn preparing for guiding tours 12 years ago were all the kings and queens of England and what were their views of Ireland and how did it link in with, and I was kind of, but very strong links. And you'll see this again and again in Kinsale in the architecture of the town and the religious diversity I'll talk to you about later. But when Phil's ancestry was here, in the early 1600s, this was a very exciting time in Kinsale. An economic boom was beginning, which was about to last almost 200 years. You know, with the Celtic Tiger economy recently, I don't know how long that lasts. Our Celtic Tiger is whimpering in the corner now. But what was the economic boom driven by here? It was driven by the fact that out to the west of here, the New World discoveries were made, you know, the Americas. And after 1607, Jamestown, suddenly a lot of English ships began to sail by Kinsale, heading westward. We began to provision a lot of those ships for the crossing. Do any of you have ancestry that left Europe in the 16 or 1700s? Well, obviously Phil would have, and yourselves. They would have taken, back then, 2 or 3 months to sail across the Atlantic. Incredibly dangerous voyages under sail. And all of the passengers crossing needed, per person, almost a ton of provisions. Sounds alarmingly high, but not all of the weight was food. Bedding was included in the weight, and a lot of the weight was in liquid form. Notice I don't say water. You see, you had to kill bacteria. Sorry, air conditioning here, Irish style. You had to kill bacteria. 2 ways of doing that: alcohol and salt. So the drink of choice would have been beer, barrels of beer rolling down here. And in some cases, ships provisioned here 300 years ago, where the crew were promised, in their victualling allowances, a gallon of beer a day each.
Wow.
8 pints a day, sounds about right, doesn't it? And no water from here onward. So even on ships like the Mayflower, the women and children drank beer, much safer. We also provision ships with barrels, oak barrels, full of salted fish, beef, pork, cheese and butter. Remember, they wanted calories back then. In Kinsale also we made rope, sailcloth and bedding. So everything you needed for a long voyage could be pre-ordered and picked up here. And also, just before the ship sailed out, normally, if they were crossing the Atlantic, the decks of the ships would be filled with live animals. It's like a bleak version of Noah's Ark. They were the first to go, and off they sailed. Now, one of the features of the harbour which encouraged this trade were, of course, the military forts, Charles and James Fort. I'll tell you all about them later. They protected not just the town from attack in the harbour, but English ships coming in and out. A famous voyage left here, you've all heard of, in 1703. You've all heard of it because today it's known as the Robinson Crusoe voyage. It inspired the famous novel by Defoe. It was captained by William Dampier, famous character in Australian history, the first Englishman to set foot in Western Australia. He's not as famous as Cook, even though he landed almost 100 years earlier, because he made the mistake of writing nothing of interest here. All he saw was the sand, and not the mineral riches that lie beneath, because he landed over near Perth. But after that landing, he came to Kinsale, and he captained the voyage, 200 crew on 2 ships, leaving Kinsale 1703. Aboard one of those ships was Alexander Selkirk. A year later, he was marooned on an island in the Pacific Ocean, lived on that island, survived for 4.5 years, and returned to tell the story. It was his life on the island, Selkirk's life, that inspired Defoe to write The Adventures of Robinson Crusoe. So make sure when you go back home, tell the youngsters that here in Kinsale you've walked in the footsteps of the real Robinson Crusoe, the Harry Potter of the 18th century. That's the children's classic back then, you know. But here's another leg of the story. I find this fascinating as well. So we provisioned New World traffic going outward. We also welcomed treasure fleets and ships coming back. Now, why was that? Well, think about this. If you're returning from the New Worlds with a haul of treasure, maybe gold, silver, spices, rum, cotton, tobacco, fine china or tea, often from here, heading to London or Rotterdam, your most dangerous part of your voyage was ahead of you. The English Channel. The French were waiting. French privateers. It's like the salmon and the bear. The bear doesn't wait for the salmon out in the middle of the ocean. They were waiting where it got narrow and the odds were higher. So why not, instead of risking losing everything on the last hurdle, why not bring your treasure in to the first English fortified harbour, drop anchor inside these forts here, and wait for a convoy of ships to gather, enough to justify an escort of men of war, huge military ships, to escort the treasure safely home. And I want to show you actually a coin which originates from one of those treasure hauls. I'll pass it around here now. It's made of silver. Silver was like the Visa or MasterCard back then, because you could spin this coin anywhere. They didn't mind whose head was on it. They weighed it. It was worth its weight in silver. And this has the head of King George II on it. I believe he's the king after which Georgia was named in America. But let me tell you the story of this silver. This silver's story is very interesting. It began its life in the silver mines of the Spanish Empire in Potosí, present-day Bolivia, mined by the Spanish, taken by Lama then overland to Lima, then overland and across South America, onto Spanish New World treasure ships and back to Spain. However, in this case, halfway across the Atlantic, English privateers pounced and captured one of those ships full of silver and brought it into Kinsale in the early 1700s. And when they dug here beneath cocoa beans, they found 80 tons of solid silver.
Wow.
So they sent a boat to England with no treasure aboard to tell the king, King George II. He immediately sent an escort here and had that ship escorted to Bristol, directly 150 miles east of here, and then taken off by wagon and delivered to the Royal Mint, where he had coins made from it all. Enough silver to generate a new coinage. And I'll pass it around, very interesting detail on it, because you see the King George, or the head of King George VI, of course, and beneath his head, he could not resist impressing these letters, L-I-M-A. It became known as the Lima coinage. Can you imagine what the Spanish felt when they saw that? Because not only had the English stolen their treasure, but rubbed their noses in it by printing Lima. And notice on the back of the coin as well, the Irish harp. It was currency here. Now, how much was that worth? That's a shilling. I'll pass around. And if you were alive back then, this was a day's wages for a skilled labourer in the Wedgwood pottery in England. A shilling a day. By the way, it cost me a day's wages to buy it recently. So it's all relative. But that's due to the rarity of those. And if you were to divide 80 tons of silver into coins of this value and translate it to today's worth, you're looking at a fortune in excess of 3 billion euros on that treasure ship. Whole economies could swing on these privateering hauls. Now, the benefit for Kinsale was indirect. You could not land the silver here. Taxes had to be paid. Well, this is going directly to the king, so he took care of that. But generally, taxes had to be paid on the trade. Our benefit was indirect, because we had very wealthy, hungry and thirsty sailors in the harbour. So provisioning, again, but a much closer version to this. So we two legs of the trade: provisioning the New World ships on the way out and welcoming the New World fleets back. And if you're ever digging in your attic back home and come across a chest of coins with Lima on them, please give me a call. I'll be on the first flight over. Okay? So there's a slice of life during your ancestors' time here, Phil. Can you imagine the wooden sailing ships sailing in? And you know, the coopers, 120 coopers working in the town, the farmers preparing all this produce. Quite a busy town, actually, under English rule. Now, just before we started our tour, you noticed Kinsale is not a harbour of industry at all today. This is a harbour of leisure. You have to have a yacht in Kinsale to keep up with the McCarthy's and the Fitzgeralds down here. The reason for this is simple: scale. You see, our harbour was perfectly scaled for sailing ships of the 16 and 1700s. Then in the 18 and 1900s, much bigger ships appeared on the horizon, eventually steamships. And they chose another harbour just east of here called Queenstown, today known as Cove, famous as the last port of call of Titanic. So all the big ships left. Kinsale then became a thriving fishing village through the 18 and early 1900s. But still thriving, employing 6,000 people in fisheries 150 years ago here. Now, mentioning steamships, of course, we have our own steamship story to tell, Lusitania. I'm going to show you that in a while. And our next steps now, though, I'm going to show you a sculpture of old Kinsale as it was when the shoreline was here. Because otherwise, I'm asking you to use your imagination quite a lot. The water down here and boats coming in. And let's see that sculpture and we get our bearings as to where we are in the sculpture. It'll help us on the rest of the tour reimagining events a lot closer. And meanwhile, those of you who haven't seen the coin, maybe see it at our next stop, because passing as we move, I'm worried about the grills on the road, you know. There's also